It was a quiet evening, the kind that blankets the small neighborhood in a sense of calm. A lone man, Tarek, sat on his porch, enjoying the cool night air. He took a slow sip of his beer, savoring the crisp taste, and leaned back in his chair. The streets were unusually empty tonight, and Tarek found the solitude comforting. His roommate Zane was out for the evening, so he had the place to himself, a rare luxury. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Tarek noticed something odd, a figure walking down the street. At first glance, it seemed like just another person heading home, but something was off. The man moved with a strange, jerky gait, almost robotic. His upper body remained unnaturally stiff while his legs moved in exaggerated, swinging motions. Tarek's initial thought was that the man might be injured, but there was something deeper, something unsettling about the way he moved. He wasn't stumbling like a drunk. He was almost too deliberate, as if he was trying to imitate normal human movement and failing. Tarek set down his beer, his fingers tensing around the cold glass bottle. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the figure stop right in front of his house. For a long, uncomfortable moment, the man simply stood there, head tilted slightly to the side as if he were listening to something Tarek couldn't hear. The porch light cast long shadows across the man's face, obscuring his features. Tarek's heart began to race, a wave of dread washing over him. It was as if this stranger knew he was being watched and was relishing in the silent fear he was creating. Without breaking eye contact, the stranger took a single step towards the driveway. Tarek's breath hitched. He was frozen for a moment, every instinct telling him to run. He bolted up, spilling his beer as he darted inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands fumbled as he turned the deadbolt, his fingers suddenly clumsy with adrenaline. The house, once a refuge of calm, now felt like a cage. He pressed his eye against the peephole, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Outside, the man had stopped at the foot of the driveway. Tarek's mind raced. Was this a prank? Was the man lost? But those thoughts vanished when he saw the stranger reach into his coat. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though he wanted Tarek to see. He pulled out something long and metallic. It glinted under the streetlight, a crowbar or maybe a hammer. Tarek couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. His blood ran cold. This man wasn't lost. He was here with a purpose. Tarek stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. He ran upstairs, 2 steps at a time, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He grabbed his phone, fingers trembling as he dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked, her voice calm and steady. There's a man. He's trying to break into my house, Tarek whispered, crouching low, hoping the intruder couldn't hear him through the thin walls. He's got a weapon. Please, send someone quickly. We're dispatching officers now, stay on the line. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tarek could hear the creak of the floorboards downstairs, the soft thud as the man's boots made contact with the wood. Then came the splintering crack of the door being pried open. Tarek's heart stopped. He pressed himself into the corner of his bedroom, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The intruder was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and heavy. They moved with a dreadful precision, as if the man knew the layout of the place. He paused at the bottom of the stairs. Tarek could feel his presence even though he couldn't see him. An oppressive, malevolent force lingering just out of sight. He held his breath, squeezing his eyes shut, willing himself to become invisible. Then, red and blue lights flashed through the window, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. A loud voice called out from below. Police, put your hands where we can see them. The footsteps didn't stop immediately. For a second, Tarek thought the man would continue up the stairs, but then there was a loud crash. The officers had forced their way inside. Tarek waited, paralyzed with fear, until he heard the scuffle downstairs. Muffled voices, a struggle, and then silence. He stood, his legs shaky, and crept down the stairs. The police were there, 2 officers pinning the man to the ground. The intruder lay still, his face pressed into the hardwood floor, a blank, glassy expression staring back at Tarek. "What the hell happened?" Tarek managed to ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. One of the officers looked up, shaking his head. "We found him like this, intoxicated, barely responsive. He won't say why he was here or what he wanted." The stranger's eyes flicked up, locking with Tarek's for a moment, and he felt a shiver go down his spine. There was no drunken haze in those eyes. They were clear, almost calculating. It was as if the man knew something Tarek didn't, a secret he'd carried into the house with him. They hauled the man to his feet, dragging him out to the waiting squad car. As they passed the porch, the man twisted his head back towards Tarek, a slow, unnatural smile curling across his lips. "See you soon," he whispered, his voice slurred yet disturbingly coherent. Tarek stood frozen on the porch as the car drove away, the echo of those words lingering in the cold night air. He knew then this wasn't over. Under the moonless sky, a group of Boy Scouts and their Scoutmaster Alwyn settled around the dying embers of their campfire deep in the wilderness of Black Pine Forest. The boys, dressed in their uniforms, felt a mix of excitement and fear. This was their first camping trip so far from home. The darkness seemed thicker here, wrapping the trees like a shroud. They were miles away from the nearest road, surrounded by nothing but towering pines and the sounds of the forest. Alwyn, a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen both the beauty and brutality of the wild, looked over his group of boys. Arlo, Tivon, Cedric, and the youngest, Lyle. He had led many such trips before, but something about tonight felt different. The wind carried a chill that sank deep into their bones, and the usual calls of owls and rustling leaves had gone silent. "All right, lads," Alwyn said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's time for a ghost story." The boys huddled closer, faces lit by the flickering light. Alwyn began, his voice low and grave. But as he spoke, the night seemed to listen, as if the very forest held its breath. Suddenly, a deep rumbling growl cut through the night air, silencing Alwyn mid-sentence. The boys froze, every eye wide with fear. The growl was unlike anything they had ever heard, deep, resonant, and far too close. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any creature they could recognize. The boys looked to Alwyn, their fearless leader, but even he had gone pale. "Everyone stay quiet," Alwyn whispered. His voice, usually so steady, now had a tremor. He slowly reached behind him for his rifle, which he always brought on these trips as a precaution but had never once needed to use. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy, padded footsteps. The firelight barely reached the edge of the forest, but in the darkness, 2 pairs of eyes reflected back, golden, piercing, and unblinking. Mountain lions. And not just one, but 2. Tevin let out a small gasp, and Alwyn shot him a sharp look, pressing a finger to his lips. The boys were trembling now, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. Arlo squeezed his eyes shut, while Lyle, only 12 years old, clutched his brother Cedric's hand, tears welling up in his eyes. Cedric wrapped an arm around Lyle, his own fear pushed aside by a need to comfort his sibling. The lions stepped into the light, their sleek bodies low to the ground, muscles rippling under their tawny coats. They were hunting. Alwyn knew that if they ran, they wouldn't make it far. He had taught the boys everything about staying calm in the face of danger. But this was different. The wild wasn't just a lesson anymore. It was real, and staring them in the face. Alwyn slowly raised his rifle, aiming it into the air. He knew a direct shot could provoke the animals, but a warning might scare them off. He hesitated for a heartbeat, meeting the gaze of the lead lion. There was an intelligence there, a cold calculation that made his blood run cold. He pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot shattered the silence, echoing through the forest. The lions flinched, ears pinned back. For a moment, they seemed ready to pounce despite the noise. But then they backed away slowly, eyes still locked on the group. It felt like hours before they finally disappeared into the trees. The boys sat motionless, the night suddenly feeling even darker without the reflection of those eyes. Alwyn lowered his rifle, his hands shaking slightly. He had faced wild animals before, but never had he felt so vulnerable, responsible for so many young lives. He could see the terror on their faces, the kind that doesn't just fade away with daylight. "All right, boys," he said softly. "Let's pack up. We're leaving now." There were no protests, no complaints about the sudden end to their adventure. They moved in silence, extinguishing the fire and gathering their gear with shaky hands. The hike back to the trailhead was long and tense. The forest, usually filled with life, seemed dead now, as if it too had sensed the danger and chosen to hide. Lyle stumbled at one point, and Cedric quickly helped him up. The bond between the boys, forged in the heat of fear, had grown stronger. Tevin walked close to Alwyn, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by quiet respect for the man who had protected them. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with the first light of dawn, they finally reached the road. They piled into the van, silent but for their ragged breathing. Alwyn took one last look at the forest before starting the engine. It felt like they were leaving a part of themselves behind. On the drive home, no one spoke. The boys, once excited and full of energy, stared out the windows, lost in their own thoughts. They had come face to face with something primal, something that didn't care about their plans or dreams. It was a glimpse into the untamed, indifferent wild, a reminder that they were not the masters of this world, but mere visitors. When they got back to the city, Alwyn watched the boys reunite with their parents, clinging to them with a newfound appreciation. He knew they would never forget this night. He would never forget it either. It was a silent lesson, one that couldn't be taught by words, but only by experience. As he drove home alone, Alwyn found himself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. He had seen the wild many times, but tonight it had shown its teeth. And in those eyes, golden and unblinking, he had seen something that would haunt him long after the trip was over. The forest had given them a gift, wrapped in fear, a glimpse of the raw, unfiltered face of nature. And none of them would ever be the same again. I remember it so clearly, even though it happened many years ago. My childhood home was small, nestled at the edge of a quiet neighborhood surrounded by dense woods. It was a place that should have felt safe, but the living room, that was different. Even now, as an adult, I feel a chill when I think of that room. It was the heart of the house, with its large window that overlooked the dark forest, the worn-out brown carpet, and, most unsettling of all, the old rocking chair in the corner. The chair had belonged to my great-grandmother. It was heavy, made of dark wood, and creaked loudly whenever anyone sat in it. I never liked that chair. It was almost as if it had a presence of its own, a piece of the past that had carried something with it. But my mother loved it. She said it reminded her of family gatherings long gone. One evening, I was alone in the living room, playing with my favorite set of toy cars. My mother was busy in the kitchen, humming softly to herself. It was a typical night, or at least it started that way. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. I was just about to race my cars down the hallway when I heard it. The soft, rhythmic creaking. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I glanced up and saw the rocking chair moving, gently swaying back and forth. It was slow, almost as if someone invisible was sitting there, lost in thought. I froze. My eyes locked onto the chair. There was no draft, no open window, just the chair, moving on its own. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to scream for my mother, but no sound came out. Then it stopped. Just like that, the chair was still again. I bolted to the kitchen, breathless and pale. I tugged on my mother's sleeve, trying to tell her what I had seen. She just chuckled, wiping her hands on her apron, and said, "You've been watching too many scary movies, little one. It's just your imagination." But it wasn't. I knew what I saw. The next night, I felt uneasy in the living room. I avoided looking at the rocking chair, keeping my focus on the TV. I was trying to distract myself, but the air felt different, heavier. I kept glancing towards the kitchen doorway, half expecting to see something, though I didn't know what. My mother was putting dishes away, the clinking of ceramic the only sound in the house. Then, without warning, a loud crash broke the silence. I jumped up, my heart racing again. One of the cups had fallen off the shelf, shattering into pieces on the floor. My mother cursed under her breath, rushing to clean it up. I stood there trembling. The shelf was sturdy, and the cup had been placed securely. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything, but my mother must have noticed the look on my face. "It's just an accident," she said, her tone more firm this time. "Stop worrying about it." But it didn't feel like an accident. Not to me. The following night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the unease that had been building up inside me. Then I heard it, the radio in the living room. It clicked on by itself, the volume turned up loud. A burst of static filled the room, followed by the haunting notes of a song I didn't recognize. I shot out of bed, terrified. I ran to the living room, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The radio sat on the mantel, its dials spinning as if controlled by an invisible hand. I stood there, staring at it, the music echoing in the darkness. My mother stormed in, her face a mix of anger and confusion. "Why did you turn this on?" she snapped. I stammered, pointing at the radio, but she just shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "Enough of this nonsense. You need to stop making up stories." She turned off the radio, the room falling back into an eerie silence. I wanted to argue, to make her believe me, but I could see it in her eyes. She had already dismissed it. I never spoke about it again, but the memory haunted me for years. Even as I grew up, moved out, and started my own life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us in that house. It wasn't until my mother decided to sell the place that she finally admitted it. We were sitting together, looking through old photo albums when she sighed and said, "You know, sometimes I'd hear that chair creaking at night too. But I didn't want to scare you. I told myself it was just the wind." I looked at her, stunned. She met my gaze, her eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I think there was something in that house," she whispered. "Something that never really left." To this day, I can't walk into a room with an old rocking chair without feeling a knot of fear twist in my stomach. I still hear the soft creaking in my dreams, the sound of someone, or something, rocking gently back and forth, waiting for me to notice. The rain was coming down in thick sheets, a relentless downpour that turned the road into a blur of glistening black. I was hauling a load through the backcountry, the kind of stretch where the highway seemed to swallow you whole. It was just past midnight when the call crackled through my CB radio. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. A soft, trembling voice that I barely recognized as Valen. a trucker I'd known for years. "Good Grayson," she stammered. "I need help. I'm at mile marker 94. I've been stabbed." The blood drained from my face as I yanked the wheel, my heart pounding like the roar of the engine. Valen was tough. She'd been trucking longer than I had, and she wasn't the type to spook easily. Whatever had happened, it was bad. Real bad. I floored it, the tires skidding in the wet, the darkness outside the cab feeling thicker, more oppressive. My mind raced with the countless nights we'd shared stories over the radio, swapping tales of near misses and weird encounters. But nothing like this. Nothing close. I found her pulled over, her truck barely visible through the sheets of rain. My headlights cut across her rig, and I jumped out, the cold rain soaking me instantly. When I reached her, the sight stopped me dead in my tracks. Valen was slumped against the seat, one hand clutching her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Her face was pale, and her breaths came in short, ragged gasps. "Grayson," she whispered, her eyes wide, glazed with pain and fear. "Who did this?" I demanded, feeling the ice crawl up my spine. "Hitchhiker," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "I thought he was just a kid. I thought he needed help." She trailed off, shuddering. My stomach twisted as I grabbed the CB mic and called for help, my voice unsteady as I relayed the emergency. It felt like an eternity before I turned back to her, kneeling down beside the open door. I pressed my hand over hers, trying to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, Valen. What happened? Where is he?" Her eyes darted around, wild and unfocused. "Gone," she muttered. "But his eyes, Grayson. I've never seen eyes like that. Empty, like he wasn't human." I swallowed hard, glancing out into the night. The rain beat against the asphalt, masking every sound, turning the world into a dark, wet void. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that those empty eyes were still watching from the shadows. "I saw him walking by the road," she continued, her voice frail, barely more than a whisper. "He looked harmless. Young, maybe 20, wet to the bone. I've picked up hitchhikers before, you know that. But this one..." Her voice broke and she winced, gripping her side harder. "He was quiet at first, polite even. Then, something changed. He smiled, but it wasn't right. It was like he was wearing someone else's face. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine despite the rain. I squeezed her hand tighter, trying to give her some strength. "You're gonna be okay, Valen. The ambulance is on its way." But she shook her head. "No, Grayson. Listen to me. There was something wrong with him. When he pulled the knife, it was like he became a different person. He didn't say a word, just watched me while he stabbed me. Like he was studying how I reacted." Her words sent a chill through me. I've seen my share of crazies out here, but the look on Valen's face was something I'd never forget. It wasn't just fear. It was horror. A deep, bone-chilling terror I'd never seen in her before. I glanced out at the road again, feeling exposed under the dim glow of her cab light. The rain seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. Whoever he was, he could be anywhere. Maybe he was watching us right now, blending into the darkness. "He left me here," she continued, her voice fading. "He didn't run. He walked away, like he knew. Like he knew I wouldn't make it." I couldn't find any words to comfort her. The rain felt colder, like it was sinking into my bones. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint wail of a siren in the distance. I kept my eyes on the road, scanning for movement, for any sign of that stranger. But there was nothing. Just the rain, the darkness, and the slick, empty highway. The ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics moving with a kind of calm urgency that told me they'd seen scenes like this too many times before. I stepped back, feeling numb as they lifted Valen onto the stretcher. Her hand slipped from mine, cold and slick with blood. "Be careful, Grayson," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine one last time. "He's still out there." I watched as they loaded her into the ambulance, the doors slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the pit of my stomach. The red and blue lights faded into the rain-soaked night, leaving me standing alone in the dark. I never saw Valen again. She survived, but she quit trucking the day she was discharged from the hospital. She never told me more about that night, and I never asked. But I could see it in her eyes when we spoke that one last time. The fear, the lingering dread. Now every time I'm out on those long, lonely stretches of road, I can't help but glance at the shadows. I keep my doors locked tight, and I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Because sometimes, the most dangerous things aren't the ones you can see coming. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones. The ones who smile a little too wide, who you never notice until it's too late. And out here, in the darkness, you never know who or what you might meet. In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, under a sky smeared with shades of pink and orange, two friends, Levon and Rurik, trekked deeper into the forest, far from the beaten paths. They had been planning this hike for months, seeking an adventure away from the bustling city life, craving the raw beauty of untouched nature. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to exhale a cold, unwelcoming breath. The vibrant colors of the sky melted into an inky blackness, and the once playful sounds of chirping birds were replaced by an unnerving silence. "We should have reached the campsite by now," Levon muttered, glancing at his watch. The faint light from his headlamp did little to pierce the thick veil of darkness around them. Rurik checked the map with furrowed brows, but it didn't help. They were lost. The dense forest swallowed every direction, each tree looking identical, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to the sky. A creeping sense of unease began to settle between them. "Let's keep moving. We'll find the trail eventually," Rurik suggested, though his voice wavered with doubt. They pushed forward, but the forest had a way of warping distance and time. An hour felt like minutes, and yet they only seemed to be getting deeper into the woods. Then they saw it. A flicker of light between the trees. It was faint but unmistakable, the steady glow of a flashlight. Relief washed over them like a wave. "Finally, someone else is out here," Levon whispered, breaking into a grin. They hurried toward the light, eager for any sign of human company in the lonely expanse of the forest. But as they got closer, their smiles faded. The figure holding the flashlight stood completely still, rigid as a statue. The beam of light was directed downwards, illuminating nothing but the damp forest floor. They called out, "Hey, we're lost. Can you help us?" The figure did not respond, did not move. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the cold night breeze. Levon's heart began to pound. He took a step closer, squinting to make out the figure's features, but the shadows clung tightly, refusing to reveal any detail. It was as if the person was merely an outline against the dark. "Maybe they didn't hear us," Rurik suggested, though his voice was edged with nervousness. He called out louder, "Hello." The figure tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, but still said nothing. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. And then, without warning, more lights flickered on, surrounding them. Flashlights, all pointed downwards, held by more motionless figures. They formed a perfect circle around the friends, blocking any route of escape. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold Alaskan air crawled up Levon's spine. "We need to go," he whispered, grabbing Rurik's arm. But Rurik stood frozen, eyes wide with fear, like a deer caught in the headlights. The figures, though unmoving, seemed to pulse with an unspoken threat, their silence more terrifying than any growl or roar. With a sudden jolt, Levon yanked Rurik, and they broke into a sprint, adrenaline pumping through their veins. They didn't look back, couldn't afford to. The forest was a blur around them, branches slashing at their clothes and faces as they ran blindly into the night. Their breath came in ragged gasps, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. They stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin, its roof sagging and windows boarded up. Without hesitation, they burst inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The interior was dark, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. An old man, hunched over and frail, sat in a rocking chair by a smoldering fire. He looked up slowly, his face creased with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You boys shouldn't be out here," he rasped, getting to his feet with surprising agility. He reached for a shotgun propped against the wall, his hands shaking. "Did they follow you?" "Who are they?" Levon asked, his voice barely a whisper, terror bleeding into every word. The old man didn't answer. Instead, he flung open the door and fired a deafening shot into the night. The noise shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their heavy breathing. Then, one by one, the figures' lights flickered off, vanishing into the darkness like they had never been there at all. The old man shut the door, bolting it with trembling hands. "You're lucky I heard you," he muttered. "They don't usually let people leave." Levon and Rurik spent the night huddled near the dying fire, the man's shotgun resting on his lap as he kept a silent vigil. No one spoke of what they had seen, too afraid to give the horror of the night any more power by naming it. At dawn, the forest looked different. The golden light filtered through the trees, casting playful shadows as if the terror of the night had been a mere illusion. The old man escorted them to a trail that led back to civilization. "Don't come back," was all he said before disappearing into the woods. They never spoke of it again, but the memory lingered, a shadow at the edge of their minds. And sometimes, late at night, when they closed their eyes, they could still see the circle of figures standing silently in the forest, flashlights pointing down, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into their domain. It was just another evening job for me, babysitting the Alderson kids in their vast, beautiful home on the hill. The family was wealthy, known for their pristine reputation in town. It was an easy gig. The kids, Cecily and Brant, were well behaved, and the house itself was a sanctuary. But that night, something was different. The air felt heavy, like a storm brewing, though the sky outside was clear. The kids went to bed without a fuss, which was unusual since Brant often begged for extra time to read his comic books. Tonight, though, they were quiet. Almost too quiet. As I tucked them in, Cecily, the older of the two, clung to my arm and whispered, "You'll stay close tonight, won't you?" Her eyes were wide, searching mine for something I couldn't understand. I reassured her, though a chill ran up my spine. "Of course, I'm just downstairs if you need me." Downstairs, I settled into the plush armchair in the living room, glancing at the clock. Mr. and Mrs. Alderson were usually home by 11, but it was nearing midnight. I decided to text Mrs. Alderson just to check in, but before I could send it, I heard footsteps behind me. "Late night, huh?" It was Mr. Alderson, smiling in a way I'd never seen before. His usual composed demeanor was replaced with something looser, almost too friendly. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been out longer than expected. "Yeah, I was just about to message your wife," I said, forcing a smile. "Oh, she won't be home for a while," he said casually, stepping closer. "She's visiting an old friend tonight." He moved to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and downed it in one gulp. "You've been so good to the kids, haven't you?" His voice dropped lower, softer, almost a whisper. "Of course. They're great kids," I replied, uneasy. I could feel his eyes on me, lingering in a way that made my skin crawl. He moved closer, sitting on the edge of the coffee table in front of me. Too close. You know, it's rare to find someone like you. So caring, he said, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. I jerked back, laughing it off nervously, but inside, panic started to build. Thank you, Mr. Alderson, but it's late and I really should be going. I stood up, grabbing my bag, but he blocked my path, standing abruptly. What's the rush? He asked, tilting his head. The friendly smile was gone, replaced by something darker, something predatory. He took another step toward me, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. We could keep each other company for a while. I took a step back, heart pounding, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to get home. It's late. Suddenly, he was right in front of me, his hand gripping my wrist hard. Don't be like that, he whispered into my ear. You're not afraid of me, are you? Every instinct screamed to run, but his grip was iron, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. Let go, I said, trying to pull away. You know, I've watched you, he said, almost tenderly, his lips grazing the side of my face. You're special. Why don't you stay a little longer? My heart raced as I realized how wrong I had been about this family. The perfect image, the perfect kids. It was all a facade. Desperately, I yanked my arm, but he pulled me closer, wrapping his other arm around my waist, pressing me against him. I couldn't breathe. I could feel tears welling up, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Summoning every bit of strength I had, I brought my knee up, hard, into his groin. He doubled over with a sharp gasp, and I didn't waste a second. I ran. I sprinted out the front door, leaving it wide open behind me, the night air slapping me awake as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, hands shaking so violently that I almost dropped it. They'll never believe you, he called after me, his voice strained but taunting. You think anyone will believe a babysitter over a man like me? I didn't look back. I ran until I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. The police came quickly, but by the time they arrived, Mr. Alderson had composed himself, standing calmly in the doorway of his home like nothing had happened. I filed the report, gave my statement through sobs and shivers, but the officers exchanged glances, skeptical. Mr. Alderson has a clean record, one of them said, almost apologetically. Are you sure this isn't a misunderstanding? I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab them and shake them, make them understand what kind of monster they were dealing with. But in that moment, I realized something chilling. He had done this before. The way he acted, the calm in his eyes. This wasn't new to him. He was confident because he knew the game, knew how to play it, and he knew no one would ever question him. I quit the job that night, blocked the family's number, and never looked back. But the guilt eats at me every day. I think about Cecily's wide, pleading eyes, her quiet plea for me to stay close. I think about the next babysitter who might walk into that house, oblivious, trusting, just like I was. I can still feel his breath on my neck, his whisper in my ear. You're not afraid of me, are you? But now I know the truth. I wasn't afraid then. Now I'm terrified. The night was unusually quiet. Lior, a young man in his early 20s, lounged on his sofa, scrolling through a list of horror movies. He was alone tonight, his roommates having left for a weekend trip. With the perfect film selected, he realized he was missing one crucial element: popcorn. It was a simple craving, but one that pulled him from the safety of his warm home and into the chilly, silent streets of his neighborhood. The small convenience store was only a few blocks away, and he made his way there without a second thought. The store was bright, almost comforting against the dark sky. Lior grabbed his popcorn, exchanged a polite nod with the cashier, and stepped back into the night. The air seemed colder now, more biting, as if the temperature had dropped in the few minutes he'd been inside. He zipped up his jacket, feeling an odd chill that wasn't just from the weather. As he walked, the soft rustle of leaves followed him, pushed by the wind. He couldn't quite shake the feeling of being watched. It started as a vague discomfort, an itch he couldn't scratch. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. The street was empty. The distant hum of a passing car was the only sound punctuating the stillness. He picked up his pace, clutching the bag of popcorn tightly. It felt silly to be scared, but the sensation grew stronger with every step. Near his house, a single streetlight flickered. It had been broken for months, casting a patch of the sidewalk in deep shadow. Lior's gaze was pulled towards it as he noticed something strange, a figure standing beneath the faulty light. He couldn't make out the face or any details, just a dark silhouette that seemed out of place. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, only stood there as if waiting. Lior's heart started to pound. He quickened his steps, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, someone walking their dog, or a neighbor stepping out for a smoke. But as he hurried forward, the figure moved too, mirroring his speed with an eerie, fluid precision. The distance between them didn't change. It was as if the shadow itself had come to life. He forced himself not to look back again, but the sound of footsteps, faint but distinct, kept pace with his own. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He broke into a jog, his breath coming faster now, visible in the cold air. He was almost home, just a few more houses away. The footsteps were louder now, closer. He could feel eyes boring into his back. In a panic, he veered off towards his neighbor's house instead of his own. Elik, his elderly neighbor, was a kind man who always left a porch light on. Lior stumbled up the steps and pounded on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. He cast a quick glance behind him, and his heart lurched into his throat. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, just beyond the porch light's reach. It was close enough now that Lior could see the shape of a head, shoulders, but no face, only darkness. It didn't step forward, didn't speak. It only watched. The door creaked open, and Elik's face appeared, confused and bleary-eyed. "Lior? What's going on? Are you all right?" "Someone's following me," Lior blurted out, his voice trembling. "I don't know who it is. They're right there." Elik's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He peered outside, his eyes scanning the empty street. "There's no one there, son," he said softly, but the doubt in his voice was clear. Lior turned back, and his blood ran cold. The figure was gone. The street was empty, just as Elik had said. It was as if it had never been there, as if the darkness had swallowed it whole. He felt his knees go weak, and he slumped against the doorframe. "You've had a scare," Elik said gently, placing a hand on Lior's shoulder. "Come inside. Let's call the police just to be safe." Inside the warm, familiar house, Lior explained what had happened as Elik dialed the authorities. The police arrived swiftly, their lights casting blue and red flashes across the walls. They searched the area, questioned Lior, and even reviewed some security footage from nearby homes. But there was nothing. No sign of the figure he had seen. No strange movements or unfamiliar faces. The officers assured him it was probably just his imagination playing tricks in the dark. But Lior knew what he had seen. He could still feel the oppressive weight of its gaze, the coldness that had settled into his bones. He thanked Elik for his help and made his way back home, feeling the emptiness of the street pressing in on him. He locked the door behind him, double-checking every window. He sat on the sofa, the bag of popcorn forgotten on the table, and stared at the screen without pressing play. The room felt darker now, the shadows thicker. In the corner of his eye, just beyond the edge of his living room window, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, like a shadow shifting unnaturally against the streetlight. He turned to look, heart pounding once more, but there was nothing there. Or at least, that's what he told himself as he drew the curtains shut, trying to ignore the feeling that something was still watching him. It was a quiet autumn evening when Rohan lost his world. His daughter, Kalia, had darted out of their front yard to fetch a ball that had rolled into the street. Rohan's heart still races with the memory of her laughter cutting through the chilly air. An innocent, fleeting sound that was silenced by the thunderous roar of a speeding sports car. The screech of tires, the dull thud, and then silence. Time stopped. His knees buckled as he ran towards her tiny, crumpled body, lying motionless on the pavement. The driver, a faceless stranger, sped off, leaving Rohan and his wife, Amara, to collapse beside their lifeless child, their grief echoing louder than any scream. Life without Kalea was an endless, suffocating void. The once vibrant home was now a mausoleum of memories. Her laughter used to fill the rooms, her drawings still covered the refrigerator. The garden, where she would twirl in circles until she got dizzy, was now a haunting reminder of her absence. Yet, despite the torment, Rohan and Amara couldn't bring themselves to leave. Moving away felt like erasing the only remnants of Kalia's short but beautiful life. The first time something strange happened, it was easy to blame it on their grief. One night, as Rohan sat alone in the garden, gazing up at the stars that Kalia loved to count, he noticed something odd. From the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow pass by the living room window. It was swift, like the fleeting image of a child darting past. His heart sank. He rushed inside, calling out to Amara, but she was in the kitchen, unaware of anything unusual. They checked the doors and windows, convinced it must have been a trick of the light or their weary minds playing cruel tricks. But it wasn't a one-time occurrence. A few nights later, as Amara lay in bed, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of a child crying. It was faint, almost like it was coming from the farthest corner of the house. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, listening intently. The sobbing grew louder, echoing through the dark hallway. It sounded like Kalia. But how could it be? Amara sprang from the bed, tears welling in her eyes, and ran to Kalia's old room. It was empty, just as it had been for months. The crying stopped abruptly, as if it had never been there at all. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Rohan, her voice trembling. He nodded, his face pale. It sounded like her. The couple held each other, clinging to the impossible hope that somehow their daughter was still there. Yet, a darker thought loomed, one they couldn't admit out loud. If it was Kalia, then why did her cries sound so heart-wrenchingly mournful, so pained? The sightings grew more frequent. Rohan would catch glimpses of her small figure reflected in the kitchen window, her silhouette standing perfectly still. Once, he saw her in the hallway mirror, her reflection looking back at him. It was Kalia, but her face wasn't the joyful one he remembered. Her expression was twisted, as though she were in agony or fear. He blinked, and she was gone, the mirror reflecting only his own horrified face. One night, it became impossible to dismiss. Rohan was jolted awake by the sound of light footsteps running down the hall. He glanced at Amara. She was still fast asleep. The footsteps stopped right outside their bedroom door. The air turned icy and the hairs on his neck stood on end. Slowly, he turned his head toward the doorway. His heart stopped. There she was, Kalia. Her small frame illuminated by the pale moonlight spilling in through the window. She wore the same yellow dress she had on the day she died, the hem stained dark as if soaked with water. But her face was all wrong. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to sink into her skull. Her mouth was stretched into a distorted, unnatural smile that didn't belong on a child's face. "Kalia?" Rohan's voice was barely a whisper, his body paralyzed with fear. She didn't respond. Instead, her head tilted slowly to one side, as though she were studying him, her smile widening until it seemed to split her cheeks. The sight was grotesque, horrifyingly unnatural. Rohan's vision blurred, his breath quickened, and before he knew it, the room faded to black as he lost consciousness. When he awoke, Amara was shaking him, tears streaming down her face. He told her what he had seen, and she didn't question it. She didn't need to. She had seen the same figure standing at the foot of their bed the previous night, and she had stayed silent out of terror and disbelief. They both knew then that whatever was in the house wasn't their daughter. Not anymore. They left the next morning, taking only the essentials. As they drove away, Rohan glanced back at the house one last time. In the upstairs window, he saw her again. Kalia standing there, watching them leave. Her face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes following their car as it disappeared down the street. They never returned to that house. It was sold, abandoned by its new owners within months. The stories continued, whispered among neighbors about the ghostly child who wept and wandered through the empty halls. Rohan and Amara moved far away, but they could never escape the sound of her crying, which haunted their dreams for the rest of their days. They had lost Kalia once, but whatever had come back in her place was something they wished had stayed dead.